Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today it's a big one. We're going to be talking about the newest project from Kesha, Gag Order. I feel like there's a lot of us who have been expecting Kesha to make this album for quite some time. Hell, for those of us who have been longtime fans of Kesha since the very early days, this has always been lurking between the lines, in the margins. A yawning, haunted darkness that amidst all the glitter and whiskey was always there, albeit never quite in frame. And it was that sort of darkness that, at least to me, felt weightier, calling back to the nastier edges of psychedelia that Kesha has cited among her influences for a decade now, giving her colorful splashes of electro-pop a grimy realism of what wasn't that far away. I'm not sure where it first really crept through. I think it might have been on Cannibal, but I remember noticing it most back in 2012. First on her Deconstructed EP, where a selection of songs were given spare, increasingly downbeat and haunted instrumentals. And then there was her work with the Flaming Lips on their albums, The Flaming Lips and Their Heady Fwens, that year, which led to rumors of a full-length collab project called Lipsha that would sadly never come to light. And by now, we all know why. I've talked about the nightmarish situation with Dr. Luke in multiple videos for years now. I don't want to recap it again. Especially as by Rainbow in 2017 and the advent of the Me Too movement, even if all the court cases had nearly all fallen against Kesha, it felt like there was at least some sort of public outcry, a sense of redemption, and then thanks to Dr. Luke signing Doja Cat and a deal with Kemosabe that looks just about as predatory, if I buy anything Doja Cat's been saying, and the willingness of plenty of acts to work with him again in the music industry willing to reward them. Hell, if you can make more hits, it's amazing how fast people ignore allegations if more money can be made. It felt like a real backslide that left Kesha alone, facing a defamation suit from Dr. Luke and a court order to not speak on the issue, hence the title of this album. Now, this has left Kesha in rough waters. Rainbow did well, almost purely on sales, and saw Grammy nominations, but no wins. Although she probably should have won. Her next album, High Road, seemed like an attempt to go back to fun, flashy pop, keep the career momentum going, especially as such a positive response to Rainbow guaranteed that Kemosabe couldn't interfere that much, as she was one of the few remaining acts on the label's roster that could make money. Doja Cat had released Hot Pink in late 2019, but that project was a slow burn to get any sort of crossover traction. But a couple major problems derailed all those plans. The first being that Kemosabe had no interest in pushing any single, and RCA is utterly incompetent. The second being that High Road wasn't exactly Kesha's best. I blame her co-writers and producers for that, and just a thinner sound overall, although Resentment is one of her best ballads ever. And the third being the fact the album dropped in late January of 2020, a few months before the pandemic effectively killed her tour. This left Kesha in a really rough place. And while there's been some bright spots, Cannibal would go viral and become a minor hit, she had a reasonably successful podcast, she'd collaborate with Walker Hayes on Fancy Like that got him the pop crossover attention, she even had a Discovery Plus show in 2022 that had a brief run. Honestly, Kesha's been pretty damn good on TV for years now. I would not be surprised to see more of that in the future, but even beyond that, things were rough. And now it's 2023, and we got a new album that's entirely produced by Rick Rubin, albeit with the occasional side producer who's stepping in, including Kesha herself. Now, reportedly, this is her last album with Kemosabe, and it's not one that I expected to chart any songs whatsoever. Hell, from what I can tell with the whole mess with the physical copies, the rollout's been kind of tumultuous as well. And that left me with some very conflicting emotions. On the one hand, Rick Rubin's not exactly cheap to get on production these days, and Kemosabe and RCA have been beyond dogshit promo. They would have less than zero interest in really pushing this. But hey, you know what? If this is Dr. Luke finally cutting his losses to move the hell on, given that Doja Cat and Becky G are stars enough in their own right worldwide, assuming he's got much direct control over any of this, given how his mismanagement of Kemosabe forced Sony to step in years ago, maybe this is just one last element to clear the books so Kesha can finally be free. Either way, from the early singles and critical acclaim suggesting that this was Kesha's darkest, most experimental record to date, I was certainly intrigued to hear more, even if as someone who's been on this ride for a very long time, I was setting myself up for a pretty rough listen. So with all that, how's Gag Order? I've talked before about albums that feel like culminations, where if you have all the context from previous years or previous releases, they're going to hit that much harder because you know the roots of all of it. And while Rainbow may have opened up that door for it and High Road felt like a feint away from it, Gag Order is diving straight into what some of us have known or seen for about a decade now. Thus, from my standpoint, it is a boundary-pushing and utterly harrowing listen that I can personally argue will be among the best albums of 2023. But the big qualifier to that is that I've got all the context, not just the data, but the history as someone who has followed this emotional journey for years now. For pretty much everyone else, you're heading into a stridently uncommercial, psychedelic nightmare that is deeply rooted in art pop, freak folk, and gospel, where you might recognize some of the influences, but like with every Kesha album, the fusion is utterly unique. In other words, I think there's a part of me that wants to say this is Kesha's 808s and Heartbreak, but it's probably closer to her Strange Mercy. And yeah, those are some big comparison points that this album more than achieves, absolutely deserves, but makes it kind of tough to talk about. And I want to start off with that 808s and Heartbreak comparison because it is so loaded, especially in Kanye's catalog, but also so very apt the more thoughts I gave it, and that begins with Kesha herself. She's always bent auto-tune to amplify her presence on record, despite being a legit excellent singer who doesn't really need it to clean anything up. But the way that Kanye West used auto-tune back on 808s was to accentuate his alienation, his distance from the larger world, and against increasingly spare and brittle mixes full of harsh synths and blocky percussion, this is where Kesha really taps into that emotional spectrum. But she doesn't just stay there. In fact, between all the overdubs, the multi-tracking, and all the choral, borderline southern gospel backdrops, this is probably the most expansive showcase of Kesha's singing to date. She's described this album as sounding the way my head feels, dipping in and out of depression, gratitude, rage, and hope, always moving. And that plays a major factor in how the vocals are mixed and mastered here. Binaural pickups where Kesha's voice will alternate across your ears and pull you deeper into this dizzying hall of broken mirrors. It's built to disorient you, make you feel uneasy, unless you've known all this was coming, and then it's intended to amplify that lingering sense of dread. Now, there are some consequences to this. Sometimes the songs can feel a bit abortive or jagged in some of the compositions, where ideas might not fully coalesce into the punchy pop tracks that everybody knows and loves. Or if they shamble on a little bit too long without fully hitting a climax like on Living in My Head. There are more that work than don't, because Kesha always maintains a focus on melody and mantra, and Rick Rubin is a great enough producer to create that haunted, spacious atmosphere where any rough edges left in the mixing is intentional. But if you are only used to Kesha's hits, this is gonna sound alien. It might be about the last thing you are prepared to hear or want to hear on the other side. But even if you've accepted that this is probably closer to the art pop side of the spectrum, the other comparison to 808s and Heartbreak is that this particular approach to sound and experimental pop can wear its influences pretty starkly if you're in the know. For 808s and Heartbreak, it was the Postal Service, especially Kid Cudi, where I'd also hear splashes of his rough edges across Gag Order. But the heavy reliance on interweaving choral passages remind me a lot of Björk, and the shift in time signatures and the patter at the end of the drama, it's pretty much a straight lift from Fiona Apple's circa Fetch the Bolt Cutters in 2020, along with a nice little Ramones interpolation there too. But the most stark parallel, at least for me, is early 2010's St. Vincent, specifically Strange Mercy, and the blockier synth bass, the sharper percussion, and the waves of vocal airing before she became way too alien and stiff on that self-titled album in 2014. But even still, that's inexact. Kesha's roots are in rougher vintage psychedelia and country and gospel. They give whatever guitars show up a slightly warmer texture. It's a looser, more ragged album, and while some of the ethereal moments might call to mind some of those raw flashes of transcendence, Kesha's not one to hold the audience at arm's length. She is dragging you down this spiritual journey with her, and it's a winding road. The opener, Something to Believe In, is a great example, with the freak folk cyclical progression that almost feels like a nursery rhyme out of hell, and then a haunted transcendence from Eat the Acid evokes just as much horror as ecstasy or bliss in how those synths build up. Then there are the bangers, of which I'm kind of cautious to describe as because they can seem just as demented, like Only Love Can Save Us Now, which splits up as crushing industrial bass on the verses with choppy acoustic strumming, gospel piano, and organ, inspired by the sort of religious music where the ecstasy can be terrifying and thrilling simultaneously, or how the drama literally builds off of a plea for distraction, where existential emptiness with the house groove that only seems to set up that coming freakout that feels like you're living through an actual overdose. Now, you know what? I do think if the album stayed more in this particular territory on sheer momentum and energy, folks might find this easier to digest. But the flip side is that the project does get ballad heavy, especially on the back half, where the synths are still harsh, the keys are still faded, and while there's still plenty of weirdness, the old-fashioned backing vocals behind All I Need Is You, the aching off-key vibes of Too Far Gone, the warbling auto-tune breakdown of Peace and Quiet, with that really striking trilling outro against some slightly more conventional program percussion, that they're co-produced by Hudson Mohawk, and if I gotta be honest, I put his contributions on this project on there and Living in My Head as slight missteps that don't quite mesh with the overall atmosphere. But you know just how every song feels a little askew in some of the fine details in a remarkably organic way. That is one thing I'm going to unabashedly praise Gag Order in comparison with 808s. Despite all the swerves, it feels utterly cohesive to Kesha's voice and presence, uncompromising but impeccably mixed and mastered to capture all this atmosphere. None of this feels like a gimmick to me, and unlike the bricked out loudness or compression, any claustrophobia that comes from this album feels very organically created, and ergo that much darker. And that is where we're going to have to go into the lyrics and the themes, where given the current legal situation, Kesha could not directly reference anything going on with the defamation case. She had to leave in enough plausible deniability if she were to take the stand. And given that this was recorded through a number of years of lockdown, there's a much sharper focus on how the situation has made her feel, pull you into her emotional journey, and then maybe attempt to find your way out. A lot of the iconography around this album shows Kesha being trapped or strangled or suffocated, and that's a lot of the language and bluntness she uses in the poetry, especially as it becomes intermingled with loneliness, exhaustion, depression, and very real trauma along the way. It's graphic, but in the quietly horrifying way, where it's descriptive just enough to really imply a stark scene, but never fully showcase it. Let your imagination fill in the blanks with how emotive her performance is. That's also how Kesha approaches spirituality. It's primal, it's ineffable. It's the sort of thing you can feel more than you can actually explain. And when you're faced with that sort of intensity, it leads to ego death. Leads to feeling so very small compared to the larger universe. All the while with the realization that as a public figure caught up in this very public legal situation from hell, it's all on display, which leads to its own form of an anxious, crippling paralysis. Fine line is the most utterly stark in that regard, taking many of the old tabloid and critical descriptions of her and her art to grip some form of narrative that she can maybe control, made all the worse by the age-old question of whether her label making money off the trauma that she exposed on Rainbow really just helped or was just more exploitation. But when you follow it with the equivalent of a rager of Only Love Can Save Us Now that flies so very close to the edge on every single facet, it's telling how the following song is a bit of a breather. We're in the face of age and loneliness, feeling like both the soundtrack and punchline to the story, the one thing she's been able to cling to, the old cat, Mr. Peeps. And it's a real moment of genuine sweetness. And given how the drama is borderline nightmare fuel, where again you can imagine it's on the edge of an OD, it's telling by how the end of the song, she wishes she got reincarnated as a house cat. That is so very Kesha. And then the album shifts. The Ram Dass interview, referring to an old academic and guru who passed away in 2019, it hits two very important points. both in the questions of garbage as art, which many have described her old music, especially contextualized in a plea for acceptance and self-actualization in said art. How do you break free of your trauma? Not close yourself off to the world, but recognize that being open to being hurt again is far better than being among the living dead who never deal with their pain. And even then, it's not guaranteed to be enough. There is a rage at feeling like time has been wasted or misspent in relationships that she wound up responsible for ending. It reminds me a lot of Miranda Lambert's The Weight of These Wings from 2016. Another very lonely, punishing, atmospheric project processing pain and angst that comes with growing older, or the anxiety that comes with needing passion or chaos in one's relationship and then feeling hemmed in. And then by Hate Me Harder, it feels like the follow-up to Praying, but also the darker echo at everyone who has persisted in trying to punch down at her. When you've gone through the hell that she describes on this project, they feel trivial. And if that rage helps them become better by the very end or process something, she allows herself to not care or give herself some grace so she can keep moving. And by the end, fuck, she just wants to be happy. And in the internal arc of the album, she cannot allow herself to be jaded or hurt for them any longer. Her time's too precious. And I really like how open-ended the album feels, because she's not fully sure how it's all going to manifest itself. But that there is hope. You gotta believe there is, right? I mean, folks, this is one of those projects that I cannot say is going to be for everyone. If you've not bought into the harrowing, alien, deeply unsettling emotional roller coaster that is Gag Order, if all you know of Kesha are the shiny pop hits or hoping for another rainbow that was able to contextualize or commodify trauma in a more accessible package, this is not that. Despite its relatively short length and brisk pace, there's a lot to process, and the territory in which Kesha pulls you in is not designed to be comfortable, especially if all you're here for is the fun, or just even straightforward catharsis, because she gets the reality that a lot of the catharsis, it doesn't work like that. You need to find a way to keep living on the other side. I mean, recommending Lingua Ignota albums is almost easier than this, because while this is still catchy and amazingly well produced, it hits many a moment of transcendence. If you're not emotionally on board for this very personal culmination, I don't think it's going to work for you. It's not accessible. It's not easy. I doubt it's going to have any chance for any Grammys. And if you get past the weirdness of the sound, the subject matter assumes you have been listening between the lines for a decade, and very few have. I mean, I only recommend this to the diehard animals. It's ragged, it's uncomfortable, it's a really hard listen, but I also argue it's one of the best of 2023. You've been warned heavily about what you're getting into. I mean, I just think it's worth it. And Kesha, there's nothing I need to say. You did the work. You found the start of a road on the other side. And I hope the rich bounty of freedom spills forth. I think you deserve it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be very grateful. This is kind of a heavy review, but if you've heard the album, that kind of makes sense. I feel like it has to be kind of heavy to really get to the meat of this. And again, for someone who's been on this journey for a long time, to see this come forth in this way, it felt like a culmination. It really did. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in potentially supporting the channel, maybe beyond my Patreon or my merch, well, hey, on my Patreon, you got options to get albums on my schedule, albeit it'll be on pause for June. But in the meantime, you guys could go to my Discord, or hell, just support my channel directly. Until then, though, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse. I'll see you next time.